Most of us know the inspiring story of Rosa Parks, the African-American civil rights activist who refused to give up her seat on a segregated bus in Montgomery, Alabama in 1955. The bus boycott spurred by Parks' arrest would help bring down the racist laws of the Jim Crow South and turn a young preacher named Martin Luther King Jr. into the country's best-known civil rights leader. But we bet you didn't know that the story behind the bus boycott isn't quite as simple as it might seem. To start with, Rosa Parks wasn't the first black woman to resist bus segregation in Montgomery. In fact, several different women had been arrested for the same offense in the last 12 months. One of them was 15-year-old Claudette Colvin. On March 2nd, 1955, she was riding the bus home from high school when the driver demanded she give up her seat for a white woman. After Colvin refused, police officers arrived on the scene and dragged her off the bus in handcuffs. Claudette Colvin would go on to become one of 4 black female plaintiffs in Browder v. Gale, the Supreme Court case that would effectively end bus segregation. As a longtime volunteer in the Montgomery chapter of the NAACP and secretary to its president, Rosa Parks advised and supported Colvin. She knew that local black leaders had been thinking about how to confront bus segregation in Montgomery for years before 1955. She also knew they were looking for a test case, an upstanding citizen they could rally the community around. But Parks certainly didn't plan on becoming that test case herself until December 1st, 1955. At the wheel of the Cleveland Avenue bus that day was James Blake, the very same driver who had ordered Parks off his bus after a confrontation 12 years earlier. Parks was sitting in the middle section of the bus when Blake told her and 3 other black riders to stand up so that one white man could sit. The 3 other black riders moved, but she refused. Some people have said Parks was simply too exhausted from working a long day to move to the back of the bus, but she said later she wasn't physically tired, just tired of giving in to Jim Crow. The real story behind the Montgomery bus boycott may not be as simple as the myth, but it is no less powerful. The courageous resistance of Rosa Parks, Claudette Colvin, and other ordinary women became the life force of the civil rights movement.
Malcolm X is an extraordinary figure for whom African Americans have this deep affinity.
Malcolm X is one of the most historic and most significant human beings in American history.
Malcolm Little was born May 19, 1925 in Omaha, Nebraska. His father, Earl Little, was an outspoken Baptist minister and supporter of Marcus Garvey's Back to Africa movement. His push for civil rights made him the target of death threats, forcing the family to move several times. In 1929, their home in Michigan was burned to the ground, and 2 years later, Earl was found dead. This was a devastating blow for Malcolm's mother, who was eventually committed to a mental institution. Her 8 children were sent to orphanages and foster homes. In school, Malcolm was a smart and focused student until he told his teacher in high school he wanted to become a lawyer.
He wanted to be a lawyer, but they told him that they said niggers don't get to be lawyers, so that's an unreasonable goal for a nigger. And so, to some extent, America created Malcolm X. So those are the forces that made him into the person that he eventually became.
He dropped out and moved to Boston. Over the next few years, he held various jobs and moved from Boston to Flint, Michigan, to Harlem in New York, and finally back to Boston. During this period, he started his street career as a pimp, drug dealer, and gambler. In 1946, he was arrested for burglary and sent to prison. In prison, he began reading everything he could get a hold of. Inspired by his brother Reginald's conversion to Islam, Malcolm read the teachings of Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam. Malcolm dropped his slave name Little and chose X to represent his lost tribal name. By the time he was paroled in 1952, he had committed himself to the Nation of Islam. He was a very charismatic and powerful speaker who conveyed Elijah Muhammad's teaching to the masses. He was appointed national spokesman. During this time, membership increased from 500 to 30,000.
Malcolm emerged as this extraordinarily talented itinerant minister And he preached a creed of black superiority, that blacks controlled themselves.
In 1958, Malcolm X married Betty X in Lansing, Michigan. The couple had 6 daughters, including twins Malak and Malika, born in 1965 after their father's death and named for him. Malcolm X rejected the civil rights movement's use of nonviolent protest. Instead, he encouraged black men to use any means necessary to protect themselves.
That Malcolm's clarion call for blacks to mobilize and fight against racism inspired millions of African Americans. Even those who disagreed with him, they respected him as a person, as a man.
Malcolm's faith was challenged when he found out that the Honorable Elijah Muhammad had seduced several women in the Nation of Islam, and some had bore his children. In 1964, Malcolm X renounced Elijah Muhammad and left the Nation of Islam. He founded a religious organization, the Muslim Mosque Incorporated, and took a pilgrimage to the Holy Land of Mecca, Saudi Arabia. In Mecca, he met people of all races he could call his brothers. He renamed himself El Hajj Malik al-Shabazz and returned to the U.S. with new hope for the future. He founded the Organization of Afro-American Unity to unite blacks all over the world. Malcolm was seen as a threat to the Nation of Islam, and he was informed that members were plotting to assassinate him. His home was firebombed, but he and his family were unharmed. On February 21, 1965, Malcolm started a presentation at the Audubon Ballroom in New York when 3 gunmen ran up and shot him 15 times at close range. He was pronounced dead on arrival at the hospital. In his 39 years, Malcolm was constantly reinventing himself. At the end of his life, he was speaking to all races, not about civil rights, but human rights.
Malcolm's image of an uncompromising rebel who challenged and fought against racial injustice, and he was prepared to die for his beliefs.
He is a person that inspired millions of African Americans to figure out their self-worth, to elevate their self-esteem. He led people to command and demand more from the great country in which they live.
In track, everything comes full circle, though it may take time. Margaret Brennan reports on an extraordinary finish today at the White House.
It was a stand that shocked the world. American sprinters Tommy Smith and John Carlos raising their black-gloved fists in protest at the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City. Smith said the moment was overwhelming.
When you were raising your fist, what was going through your mind?
Get me off of this stand. The national anthem is exactly 1 minute and 30 seconds long, but it seemed like an hour.
That protest against racial inequality got them ejected from the Games and banished from the Olympic community for decades.
Yes, we were hated, we were vilified, but I do think because we were hated and vilified, that showed you that there was something that needed changing.
Welcome to the White House.
Today, nearly 50 years later, the Olympic medalists were welcomed back into the fold by President Obama.
We're honored to have here the legendary Tommy Smith and John Carlos here today. Their powerful silent protest in the 1968 Games was controversial, but it woke folks up and created greater opportunity for those that followed.
Oh, I felt great. I sat up there and just ate it all up.
Now a new generation of athletes has picked up the baton from Smith, led by NFL quarterback Colin Kaepernick, who kneels during the national anthem to protest police violence against African Americans. Smith supports activist athletes and said their peaceful actions take courage.
When you do something and you really believe in it, you really don't think about the cost. You just do it.
And these silent gestures are meant to speak volumes. Margaret Brennan, CBS News, Washington.
Hi, I'm Uhuru Williams. I'm a professor of history, and here's what you need to know in order to sound smart about the Black Panthers. The Black Panther Party for Self-Defense was founded in October of 1966 by 2 college students, Huey Newton, and Bobby Seale. Newton and Seale created a 10-point program to outline their political views. Among other things, the Panthers called for an immediate end to police brutality, employment of African Americans, and a call for land, housing, and justice, actually citing the Declaration of Independence. The Black Panther Party was also part of the Black Power movement, which emphasized things such as Black pride, community control, and the importance of African Americans unifying for civil rights. In 1968, the Black Panther Party dropped self-defense from its title in order to emphasize its community programs. Among the most popular of the Panthers' social programs was their Free Breakfast for Children program. They also created free health clinics in 13 communities across the United States. Despite their social programs, the Panthers were involved in numerous encounters with police, some ending in violence and bloodshed. During the 1950s and 1960s, the FBI had a secret counterintelligence program called COINTELPRO, and the Panthers became one of the FBI's chief targets. J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, famously even called the Panthers one of the greatest threats to the nation's internal security. A significant split between Panther leaders Eldridge Cleaver and Huey Newton led to internal friction, which threatened the existence of the party after 1968. The Black Panther Party was officially disbanded in 1982. Young people in large numbers came out and joined what became known as the Red Guards. These largely terroristic organizations were used to publicly humiliate, assault, and in some cases, even murder political enemies of Mao and the Communist Party.